Hello everyone, this is Orlando from A Collector's Dream. And today I want to talk about baseball in Cuba, and just kind of give you a quick history of baseball in Cuba and when it started and things like that. I was on a podcast with Mike Moynihan, a baseball collector, and we talked a little bit about Cuba. And he's been to Cuba many times, and I haven't been able to go back since basically I was born there and left when I was very young. And anyway, there's a huge history of baseball in Cuba, and it started way over 100 in let's see, in 1864. So that's how old baseball is in Cuba, and that's why baseball is so well known and so well played and loved in Cuba, and almost all the kids there play baseball. Put a couple of Cuban cards on here to show you some of the cards that actually were made in Cuba, while I talk to you a little bit about how baseball got to Cuba. And in 1864, and it came from Mobile, Alabama. That's where actually the history of Cuban baseball started. And the baseball route in 1864, after finishing his students, there were three students, and in 1858, three Cuban students, Nemesio Guillo, his older brother Ernesto, and Enrique Porto, traveled to Mobile, Alabama to study at Spring Hill College. While there, they developed a love for the game of baseball. Because remember, baseball was started in colleges, just like football. So they began to play baseball. They learned the game of baseball in Mobile, Alabama, in Spring Hill College. And then the three came back. So after their graduation in 1864, they returned home with a bat and a ball and exhibited the game in Vedado, where it quickly became popular. So it became popular in Vedado, Cuba, where they returned back from graduating from college. And they came back and they started playing the game, the first bat and the first ball. They started playing in Cuba, in the streets. And then baseball really became popular. And in 1868, the first baseball club was formed, and that was the Havana Baseball Club. Baseball spread first to the neighboring city of Matanzas and eventually throughout the country. From these humble beginnings at Spring Hill College and the efforts of these three young men, baseball has now become a part of Cuba's popular culture and national pastime. Those young Havanans are today recognized as the parents of Cuban baseball. So those three guys that went to Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, came back to Cuba and started playing baseball. And there, baseball began. And this is 1946, the Caramelo Deportivo por Felices. Kind of means like a happy candy. And this one is Dick Sizzler, card number 47. And these are paper thin, and they were made to be put on albums. And most of them were stuck on albums, and a lot of them were removed from albums. And you'll always see them with some back damage or no backs, or very little back damage. So this is what those look like. They were made in Cuba. The earliest cards were 1909 Cabanas, and I've shown those before. So those were the earliest cards. That's when Detroit went to play in Cuba, to play the Cuban teams, and they played three different Cuban teams. And this is the Propagandas Montiel from 1946. This is Orlando Moreno. So when the Tigers, the 1909 Tigers, which were the American League champions, went to play in Cuba, they made tobacco cards called the Cuban Cabanas. And then from then on, they started producing many cards in 1910, which is a 1910 punch, which are extremely rare cards. I wish I had one to show you. So those are the other early cards from Cuba. Um, but you know, the cool thing is that you know, they started making teams in Cuba, and back in those days, you know, they just, you know, got together and they played in different places. And one of the first games ever when they finally formed teams was in 1868, and they played at what was called the Roundabout of Havana, and that was in Vedado, where they first began, you know, 4 years earlier, on Paseo and Mars Street. And, you know, similar to how baseball, the first games here were played in Eliason Fields back in the mid 1800s. You know, Eliason Fields is is basically where they first started baseball, playing the first game of baseball. The first game in baseball in Cuba was played at Vedado at Paseo and Mars Street. And what happened was they formed two teams to play against each other that same year. And, you know, of course, in those days, there were many, you know, it was a port town of Matanzas. So there were some sailors that were in the port of Matanzas, and they challenged the Havana team. And I'll show you a few more Cuban players as we're at it here. So the sailors, this is one of my favorite players, Cuban players, Camilo Pascual. So so in 1868, you know, there were two teams, Cuban teams, and then the sailors came on, and they wanted to challenge the Havana team for a game at Palmar de Junco in Matanzas. And that's where the stadium where the first, you know, it wasn't really a stadium, but it was where the first game, official game, was played against the North Americans. And it's considered the first baseball game between the Cubans and North American players. And that was the 1868 at Palmar de Junco in Matanzas. And Palmar de Juncos, basically what it looked like, I'll show you, try to get you a picture. This is what it looked like. And I guess they would gather up there and stand up on the stands there and watch the game from there. And this was, I'll show you in a minute here, this is the first ticket. This was the ticket to that game. And all this information that I'm telling you is coming from the guy that actually runs or manages the Hall of Fame in Cuba. And he is the biggest card collector in Cuba, and that is Rolando. I won't say his last name, but you can find him on Net54. And I'll show you a quick thing that he posted on there showing the route. And this is the route from Matanzas, where Ernesto Guillo and Enrique Porto and his brother came from Mobile, Alabama, all the way to Havana. And the first game was played at the Castillo there in that area there. And this plaque was actually placed in Cuba that tells the story. And it tells about the 3 Cuban students in 1858. And that's basically a story I read to you. The first Cuban club was formed in Havana Baseball Club. Baseball spread to the neighboring city of Matanzas and eventually throughout the country. From these humble beginnings at Spring Hill College. Sorry about that. So anyway, that's how it started. And then it says that the marker is a friendship of the people from Havana from Mobile. And that happened early, a few years ago. And then they actually had some, and here is Orlando. And that is with an ex-American pitcher. And somewhere on there, I remember the pitcher's name. But anyway, that's the next pitcher that actually played in Mobile, Alabama, and went to Spring Hill College. And he went to Cuba to do the inauguration of that. And Rolando is basically the biggest Cuban collector. He lives in Cuba, and he has gone all over Cuba to collect the cards, and he has the biggest collection of Cuban cards, which most of the Cuban cards that you see here came from him. He went throughout the country of Cuba collecting cards. Everybody knew that he was the guy to go see if you had cards, to sell cards. And since there's not much money in Cuba, everybody came to him, and he, basically sold most of his collection already. He wrote a book about his collection. He took pictures of every card that he had, and it's a great story what he's done to be able to preserve the history and get those cards out of Cuba before they get lost in history. And these are some of the cards that were printed in Cuba. And I just want to show you, because these are so thin, and if you've never seen these in person, I gotta show you what they look like. They're almost see-through cards. See, they're paper thin. They just like flap in the wind, and it's basically a piece of paper. That's what they look like. And this is from the 1946. You're not going to get any graded more than a couple, a 2 or 3 at the most. They all have creases because it's paper. So that's what they look like. And they were printed in Cuba. There's a lot of different cards that were printed in Cuba, because Cuba just was really a hotbed for talent. One of the things that happened in Cuba was that a lot of the Negro League players went to play there, went to play in Cuba because they couldn't play here. So, players like Minnie Minoso, they played in Cuba. He was a Cuban player, and he played in Cuba for all his career until he could finally come out of Cuba and play, where he finally played for the Indians and the White Sox and other teams. So, one of the greatest Cuban players, Minnie Minoso. You can see there he was born in Marianao, Cuba. So that's Minnie Minoso. This is Camilo Pascual, one of my favorite players, Cuban players. It was my father's favorite player. And actually this was my father's card that he had, and he passed away. He had a few cards in his collection that basically I'd given him some of these, or I had purchased them for him that he wanted, and he liked Camilo Pascual, and he was a great pitcher. People don't realize how good he was. Let me show you something. In 1961, Camilo Pascual was a strikeout leader. He was better than Whitey Ford and Jim Bunning. He had 221 strikeouts versus Whitey Ford, which had the closest was 210. So he was a great pitcher. And here's an autograph card of Camilo Pascual. So I want to show you that. Here's another card of him with another great pitcher for Washington, which was Pedro Ramos. And here's another card of Pedro Ramos, another great Cuban player, Cuban pitcher. He was born in Pinar del Rio, and Camilo was born in Havana. Some more Cuban players. Tony Taylor. There's tons of Cuban players in the league that played. There's many, black players. Of course, Minoso, he was born in Managuises, Cuba. So, of course, Minoso is the top, of the heap here. He played, the only player to play in 5 decades of professional ball. And so he played many years in Cuba. And then he came to the United States. He played many years there. And he literally played professional ball in 7 decades. Because after he also batted in the minor leagues for a couple of times. And he was super old, but he actually played in 7 decades, 5 decades in the major leagues. The only player to do that. And he is known now into the Latin Americans as the first Latin black player to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, or to play, not to be inducted, but to play in the major leagues. So essentially, he's like the Jackie Robinson of the black Latinos, because he was the first black Latin player to play in the majors. So that's Minnie Minoso. And another player that my grandfather personally knew, and this was Orlando Pena. And there was a time that he played for the Orioles, and I was able to personally meet him. My grandfather introduced me to him in spring training. He autographed a ball that I have, and I've shown that in one of my videos earlier, the one that says how I started my collection. And basically, he introduced me, Orlando Pena introduced me to Brooks Robinson, Frank Robinson, Jim Palmer. Oh, they were all in the dugout at the time. Orlando Pena was born in Havana, Cuba. So it was my first experience meeting any major league players, and it was just an awesome experience. And I gotta thank my grandfather and Orlando Pena for allowing that. And I have that autographed ball. I still have it, autographed by pretty much most of the Orioles at the time. Boo Powell and Jim Palmer and Brooks Robinson and Al Bunbury and Paul Blair. And a lot of them are faded or washed out, but I still have that ball. I'll never sell that ball. And, after all these old-time players, and there's many others, of course, in the history of Cuba, there came a young superstar, which everybody loved, and this was Jose Canseco. And he was the star in Miami at the time, and in baseball when he first started. And he also, as you can see in the back of his card, he was also born in Havana, Cuba. Home Miami, but born in Havana, Cuba. So that's, it says it right here, see, it says, voted minor league player of the year. The A's 15th round draft pick in 1982. He was actually signed by Camilo Pascual, if you didn't know that. Signed by former Twins pitcher Camilo Pascual, born in Cuba, grew up in Miami, and he batted .400 for the high school team. Yeah, incredible player, incredible hitter. And he was strong, even before the steroids. He was a big, strong guy. But unfortunately, him and McGuire, hit the juice there. So I do want to show you, here's an autograph, Canseco. This was the card of back in the day. This was it. This was the top card. And the Jose Canseco rookie of this autographed in those days was just, I would have sold this immediately, but I got it personally autographed, so I kept that. And there's the actual regular card with no autograph. And there's the other one that everybody knows, the other autograph. So anyway, guys, I just wanted to give you a quick history of baseball in Cuba. Started back in 1864. And that's why Cuba loves baseball. It's the national pastime there. It's a national sport there. They don't play football there. They do play soccer and other sports, but baseball is number one by far, and has a long, rich history. And I wanted to share a little bit of that with you guys. So thanks for watching, guys. I truly, truly appreciate your support. And please like and subscribe. This is Orlando from A Collector's Dream. Have an awesome, awesome day, guys. Thanks for watching.